Cooking Show. Hello everyone, and welcome to our after-school baking show, where we learn math while baking. On The Math Chef,
starring our hosts, Chef Sophia, Chef Victoria, and Chef Jenna.
Today, we're going to show how important proportions and converting measurements are when we cook with the recipe.
The objectives of today's Math Chef are learning how to use proportions,
to understand how to follow a recipe,
to understand how to convert measurements in a recipe by using ratios and proportions.
While Chef Jenna is gathering the ingredients, Chef Sophia and I are going to teach you about proportions and converting measurements by making one of our favorite snacks,
chocolate chip cookie dip. And who doesn't love chocolate chips?
What's great about this recipe is that it's easy to make, doesn't take long, it's kid-friendly, and you don't need to bake it or use the oven.
Kids can pretty much make this on their own. But before we start, I'd like to ask you a question.
Think of a list of measurements we use when cooking.
If you answered ounces, cups, and tablespoons to the types of measurements we use when we cook, then guess what? You're correct.
Good job!
As you can see, using math is a part of our everyday life.
Next, before we move on to making our delicious, mouth-watering, scrumptious chocolate chip cookie dip,
We need to figure out how to use proportions while cooking or baking.
To answer that question, you must first need to know what a proportion is.
A proportion is an equation that states that the two ratios are equivalent.
For today's recipe, we will use
8 ounces of cream cheese,
4 ounces of butter,
a splash of vanilla extract or 1 teaspoon,
1 ounce of brown sugar,
2 ounces of powdered sugar,
2 ounces of chocolate chips,
and any of your favorite cookies or treats to dip. We will use vanilla wafers.
These ingredients will serve 5 people.
The recipe we just looked at serves 5 people, but we need to serve 20 people. Instead of making it 4 different times, we're just going to quadruple the recipe.
We need to multiply each ingredient by 4 because 5 multiplied by 4 equals 20. So to stay in proportion, we must multiply each ingredient by 4.
Before we begin, we will prepare each of our ingredients so it's easier to combine when we are ready to make it.
In this recipe, we will use 8 ounces of cream cheese for every 5 kids we serve.
Or 1 cup because there are 8 ounces in 1 cup. So we can use a cup to measure our cream cheese.
Since we are serving 20 people, we need to quadruple the amount of cream cheese. There are 2 ways to do this. One way is to do proportions.
So 8 ounces of cream cheese serves 5 people, but remember we need to serve 20 people. So what did you do to 5 to get 20? You multiplied it by 4. So whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. So then 8 times 4 equals 32, and we're going to have 32 ounces of cream cheese.
Or since the recipe calls for 8 ounces, we can multiply that by 4 to quadruple it. So 8 ounces multiplied by 4, which equals 32 ounces of cream cheese, so we will be using 32 ounces of cream cheese in our recipe.
Now our next ingredient is 4 ounces of butter.
Wait, don't forget, we're quadrupling the recipe.
Remember, there are 2 ways to do this. One way is to use proportions.
The recipe calls for 4 ounces of butter, and it serves 5 people. But we want to make it for 20 people. How do we do this? 5 times 4 equals 20, and whenever you do the bottom, you must do the top. 4 times 4 equals 16, so we will use 16 ounces of butter.
Or we can just multiply 4 ounces by 4 and get 16.
Why? To stay in proportion, and that will give us 16 ounces of butter.
And 16 ounces is equivalent to 2 cups.
To make the step even easier, if you're using sticks of butter, you can just use 4 sticks of butter because each is 4 ounces.
Now we're going to add our vanilla extract. The recipe calls for 1 teaspoon for every 5 people. But remember, we need to serve 20.
The recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of vanilla, which serves 5 people, but we want to serve 20 people. Had we get 20, we multiplied 5 by 4, and whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do the top. So 1 times 4 is 4, so we have 4 teaspoons of vanilla extract.
Or we can just multiply 1 teaspoon by 4, so we will need 4 teaspoons of vanilla.
3.
Next, we have to add some brown sugar.
The recipe says that we need to include 1 ounce of brown sugar, but the recipe is for 5 people. We need to remember, we're trying to make the recipe for 20.
Remember, there are 2 ways to do this. One way is to use proportion.
The recipe calls for 1 ounce of brown sugar for 5 people. But remember, we need it for 20 people. How do we get 20? We multiplied 5 by 4. whatever you do to the bottom, you must do to the top. So 1 times 4 equals 4. So we're going to need 4 ounces of brown sugar.
Or we can multiply the 1 ounce of brown sugar by 4, which is 4 ounces or a half a cup of brown sugar. Almost done! We need to add 2 ounces of powdered sugar for every 5 people.
But wait, don't forget we're quadrupling the recipe.
As we have seen in our other ingredients, there are 2 ways to do this. One way is to use proportions.
The recipe calls for 2 ounces of powdered sugar for every 5 people, but we want to make it for 20. So we would multiply 5 times 4 to get 20, and because we have to do to the bottom, we do to the top. 2 times 4 equals 8, and we would use 8 ounces of powdered sugar.
Or we can just multiply the 2 ounces by 4 and we'll get 8 ounces of powdered sugar.
Or a cup.
Our last ingredient. The original recipe says to add 2 ounces of chocolate chips. To quadruple it, we can use proportions.
The recipe calls for 2 ounces of chocolate chips, which serves 5 people. But remember, we want to serve 20 people. Had we got 20, we multiplied 5 by 4, and whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. So 2 times 4 equals 8 ounces of chocolate chips.
Or we can simply multiply the 2 ounces by 4 and we'll get 8 ounces of chocolate chips.
Next is the fun part. We need to add 16 ounces of butter.
Next, with the measuring cup, we're going to add 4 ounces of brown sugar.
Now, I'm going to continuously stir while Sophia adds 4 teaspoons of vanilla extract.
Now it's time to add our 32 ounces of cream cheese.
As Sophia is mixing the butter, cream cheese, and brown sugar, Victoria is adding 8 ounces of powdered sugar. Our last ingredient is
8 ounces of chocolate chips.
delicious.
Now for the fun part.
We get to eat our delicious
Mouth-watering.
Scrumptious.
chocolate chip cookie dip.
Give me some! Give me!
Fine.
Come on, give me. Here.
Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3.
That's really good.
Yeah, really good. Remember, when you make a recipe that calls for more people than the recipe serves,
You must use proportions to ensure that the recipe comes out right.
See, learning math could be fun when you do something you enjoy.